Welcome, my friends, to our multi-part series on the history of Christianity. We continue today with part 4. And part 4 is called Defenders of the Faith. We'll be talking today about those Christians who came to the defense of Christianity against the pagan culture they were in, primarily during the 2nd and leading into the 3rd centuries. This was a time of persecution that they were facing. The persecution was not ongoing and widespread as far as them being hunted down, but there definitely were martyrs, and there definitely were those of them that were being imprisoned and put to death by accusation. So they were definitely very much interested in presenting an accurate portrayal of what Christianity was all about. So we're going to look at that today and why they were so important. So we start with the need for a defense. There was a need for a defense. As I've already said, during this time, Christians were very concerned with rumors about their beliefs and practices. And one of the primary reasons for that was that misunderstandings, their ill will against them, and arrests would often begin with false information being passed on. And they definitely didn't want Christianity to be misrepresented, but they also didn't want to be arrested because they knew that that usually led with harsh punishment and for many of them death. So they wanted to be accurately portrayed, and they knew that that was very, very important. So because of that, Christian thinkers and writers were concerned with making this type of defense. They came along and they became known as apologists. So we're going to look at them, several of them today. So what was it that Christians were having to deal with? There were rumors about them that were out there that were just really crazy. One of the things that the rumors came up about were a couple of the practices that the Christians had and became known throughout the pagan culture. One was this coming together for a love feast. And we know this was a meal that Christians would have together. It was definitely for those who were in the faith. And they called it a love feast because of the love that they were supposed to have for one another, a brotherly type of love. And as we know, even to this day, Christians call each other brothers or sisters. And that is certainly from what Scripture tells us, that we are family together. We're children of God now. And because of that, we're brothers and sisters together. But a misunderstanding of these ideas and probably intentional misrepresentation gave rise to some accusations against the Christians. One was that these love feasts were not like a brotherly love, but more of like a passionate type of love, a sexualized type of love. So there were these ideas that they were having these private, lustful celebrations of excess together. And then the idea of being called brothers and sisters gave rise to the idea of there even being incestuous type of unions going on. So that was definitely something the Christians didn't like. Another thing, and it's just so weird, but if you think about it, you can at least kind of get at where this came from. The idea of communion was out there. And this led to a couple of different rumors. One was that Christians concealed a newborn in a loaf of bread. Why? Why would this make sense? Well, one of the reasons for this is obviously because of communion says that we eat flesh and drink blood. So we know that is symbolic, but for a pagan person hearing that could be something they take very literally. And so why a newborn? Well, the idea of the newborn was because in Christianity, the infant Jesus was talked about. When you read in the Gospels, you read about Jesus' birth being a big deal. And so Jesus was often talked about as being an infant. So again, it's crazy, but it brought rise to this idea that they would take a small newborn and bake that baby into a loaf of bread, and then they would have their new initiates, people that were just coming into the church, would be given the honor of cutting the bread. And these people wouldn't know about that baby, but once they did that act and cut that bread, then they were on the hook now. They had taken this life. And so everybody would then join in and eat the flesh of the baby. Again, this is just, it's gross, it's disgusting type of stuff, but these were the ideas that were out there about Christians, just bizarre things that notions were out there. But these were easy to refute. You didn't really need a lot of philosophical writings. You didn't need deep discussions. These are just nonsense, crazy stuff that would be easy to refute. And so those were bad, but definitely any Christian could come along and say that's stupid. We're not doing that. Uh, but there were other things as well. So why did they need a stronger defense than just being able to say, hey, that's you? If you just really think about this, that's crazy. We wouldn't do that. Well, there came some criticisms that were more difficult to refute. And these criticisms came from cultured pagans. These were people who were philosophers that were very much into the study of different schools of thought. And so they studied Christianity. And they did it in an academic sense. So they weren't interested in crazy, wild rumors. They weren't interested in sensationalizing things to throw dirt on Christians. But what they were interested in doing was studying Christianity in an intellectual way. And what they the conclusion they came to was Christianity was intellectually wanting. Christians were thought of as being ignorant, and the doctrines of Christianity were considered foolish and self-contradictory. So these were elitist. These were intellectual elitists, and what they what they did was they just belittled the teachings of Christianity. They latched on to some things that they thought were just preposterous ideas, and tried to basically say that you can throw the whole thing out because these ideas they don't make sense. And really, that kind of thinking hasn't gone away. Christians to this day are still being looked at in the same way, and other religions too, not just Christianity, but certainly Christian teachings to this day are being put to the test in intellectual circles, and there is elitism that goes on, in which there are those that just think that the ideas of Christianity are nonsense. And you also have some conflicting ideas. If you want to look at, probably one of the biggest criticisms of Christianity today is the thought that science and Christianity don't mix together. And it's really not true. But some of the reason for that is because there are different schools of thought, even in Christianity. So, for instance, one thing that's out there that probably an elitist type would just look at and say, well, if you believe that, then I don't have anything else to take seriously that you have to say, is the idea of the young Earth, that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. And there's definitely a segment of Christianity that hold to that. They take Scripture very literal, although Scripture never says what the age of the Earth is. They want to take everything that's in there in such a way as being able to add up years and come to this conclusion. And that's something that, people that are intellectually elitist types, academic types, certainly those that are in scientific study, would just say, well, if that's what you believe, then I don't have to listen to anything else you have to say because that's nuts. Evolution, the thought of how evolution works and how that fits into things, definitely, comes into play. Not every Christian believes the exact same way about these issues. Not every Christian would say they believe in a young earth. There are many Christians that don't believe that. Not every Christian would say just throw out evolution altogether. There are certainly Christians that have varying degrees of what they think about how evolution has played into the species on this earth. And I'm not trying to take one stance over another. That's not really the discussion here. What I'm trying to say is that even within Christianity, there's disagreements about these things. So to take one of these stances and just throw out an entire way of life for so many people for so many years, that's really not very intellectually honest either. And so there were those that took they didn't like this back in those days, and there are those of us that don't like it today as well. And it doesn't matter where you stand on these issues. We all can definitely have different opinions and be brothers and sisters in Christ. But the point is that even things that Christians themselves disagree about can be used in a general way against Christianity in some circles, and just to kind of give an excuse to throw it all away. So this is nothing new. It's been going on. We need to look at who these pagan critics were, and there were a lot of them, but we have some noteworthy ones that we need to look at. First of all, we have Celsus. Celsus was around during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, so during the back part of the 2nd century, and he wrote a refutation of Christianity called The True Word. And I have some excerpts from this I want to read for you today, so you can get an idea of what this intellectual philosophical guy had to say about throwing Christianity out the window. So here's an excerpt from this. I'm quoting now. In some private homes, we find people who work with wool and rags and cobblers. That is the least cultured and most ignorant kind. Before the head of the household, they dare not utter a word. But as soon as they can take the children aside, or some women who are as ignorant as they speak wonders. If you really wish to know the truth, leave your teacher and your father, and go with the women and the children to the women's quarters, or to the cobbler's shop, or to the tannery, and there you will learn the perfect life. It is thus that these Christians find those who will believe them. So Celsus didn't have really a lot of good things to say about Christianity and kind of how people got into believing the teachings of Christianity. He didn't have a lot of great things to say about Jesus either. One of the things that these pagans would do is they would say, well, you know, this guy Jesus that you worship, you need to remember he was a criminal and he was condemned by Roman authorities. And so it's not really valid to go along with him. Celsus even made the claim, it's still around today, some people say this, he may have been the first person, I don't know, but he made the claim that Jesus was the illegitimate son of Mary and a Roman soldier. So that kind of just is a way of devaluing the whole idea of Christianity by saying the founder of it was not legitimate. Even his birth, even his legitimacy as a human being was put into question. So those thinking kind of ideas were out there, and Celsus was one that did that. He wondered if Jesus was truly the Son of God, why did he allow himself to be crucified? Why did he not destroy all his enemies? And, you know, those are valid questions for somebody that didn't understand what was going on with this, because after all, the very people that Jesus came to, his own people, didn't understand the answer to that question either. So you can at least see where some of these ideas are coming from, but again, just kind of these guys are throwing the whole idea out. There's nothing valid here. And then I want to quote from Celsus for you again. He says this: "What could be the purpose of such a visit to earth by God? To find out what is taking place among humans? Does he not know everything? Or is it perhaps that he knows but is incapable of doing anything about evil unless he does it in person?" So Celsus is saying there, why did Jesus even need to come? You say he's God. Why did he need to come? He's God. He can do anything. He's not incapable. If he's got all the power that you say he does, he's not incapable of accomplishing things from heaven. Why did he need to come as a human being? So again, just a very much a misrepresentation of what Christians believe, but in a kind of an intellectual elitist type of way. So Celsus was one of these that was not all that popular among the Christians. And then around the same time, a guy came along named Cornelius Fronto, and he wrote his own treatise against Christianity. I want to quote from him, something from him as well. He had to say this, quote, "If you still have even a modicum of wisdom or shame, cease searching the heavenly regions and the goals and secrets of the universe. It is enough that you watch where you walk. This is especially true of people such as you, who lack education and culture and are crude and ignorant." So you see these excerpts bring about or reveal that there's not only an intellectual elitism. So they're not just saying, well, you're not on the same you're not on the same ground intellectually as me, so I don't have to listen to what you have to say. But there's definitely class prejudice as well. If you listen to those excerpts, the Christians are being put down as being in a lower class. That first one we read by Celsus talks about, well, it's just the people going to the cobbler shop. They're the people going off with the women. They're on the lower rungs of society. Why are you listening to these people? Why are you listening to these that are below us? So there was definitely that idea involved, but there's also these ideas were rooted in anti-Semitism. These pagans knew that Christianity originated with Jewish religion. And all throughout history, we read and we know that this idea of anti-Semitism has been out there. And it was definitely true at this time as well. So anything in their mind that was associated with the Jews would have been something that you could throw away as well. So because of these ideas, these elitists came along, these philosophers, and said, this Christian stuff's there's nothing to it. We shouldn't go along with it. Well, this bothered the Christians, obviously, because these arguments were not fair. They weren't really very well thought out, and certainly the idea of just the fact that I'm a different class than you, or I'm not on the same social rung as you, means that you just throw away my religious beliefs was not something that they wanted to tolerate. So the arguments of these pagan critics required thoughtful answers. They weren't going to just listen to anybody come along saying, no, that's not true, no, that's wrong. So these apologists came forth, and the reason to study these guys, these were some of the most thoughtful and strong writers at this time. The very best came forth to write these apologies. And so we get a real good sense of what Christian thought was at this time from the very best of those that wrote about it, and even some other things as well. So we're going to move now to look at who some of these apologists were. The apologists wrote in Greek primarily, but we do have some that wrote in Latin. So we're going to look at these in two separate groups. So the main apologists writing in Greek were the first one, the earliest surviving apology. The writing itself is entitled to Diognetus, and the author of this writing is unknown. Nobody knows who wrote this, but it's the earliest surviving apology that we have, so it's important to look at it for that reason. But the most famous of the apologists from this time period was Justin, also known as Justin Martyr. We talked about him last week when we talked about the martyrs, because he was martyred, probably martyred by a rival of his, or at least he was accused by the rival and then brought on charges. And he's one of the best writers at this time. He's very, very important. But we've got three of Justin's works that survive, including a dialogue with Truffaut, who was a Jewish rabbi. So these works are very important. They're very well studied. You can look them up. You can look up more about his writing and what he had to say, but he was probably the foremost one. But he wasn't the only one. One of his disciples, named Tatian, wrote an address to the Greeks. We're going to look in just a moment at more of what Tatian had to write. But he was a very important one of these apologists as well. Then we also need to look at Athenagoras. He wrote a plea for the Christians and on the resurrection of the dead. So again, another one of these apologists that had some very important writings. Then we have Theophilus. He was the bishop of Antioch. He wrote 3 books to Autolycus, which presented the doctrine of God, the interpretation of Scripture, and Christian life. Let me just pause here to say to you, I have spent a lot of time looking up the pronunciation of these names, and I've written out kind of phonetically how to pronounce them, but they still tie me up. So excuse me, I'm trying to pronounce them the right way. If you hear them and know I'm mispronouncing them, I would love for you to send me an email. You can go on our church website, simonandchurch.org. Look for Family Pastor Kenny Johnson. You can hit my email there, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that for any of these. So I am making an attempt to pronounce these correctly. So if I'm not, forgive me, but I am trying. Anyway, getting back to this study. We have these in Greek during the 2nd century. We also have one prominent one in the 3rd century, Origen, who will definitely be looking at him going forward. He wrote against Celsus, so the guy Celsus that had all the nasty stuff to say about Christians, Origen wasn't a real big fan of Celsus, so he wrote his directly refuting or trying to refute Celsus. Who were the ones that were writing in Latin? We need to look at them as well. There's not as many of them, but the two earliest writings in Latin were Octavius by Marcus Minucius Felix, and then Tertullian's Apology. And again, we talked about Tertullian last week briefly. We're going to talk about him briefly this week, but we're going to be looking at way more about Tertullian going forward because he's very, very prominent and definitely a big influence on the development of Christian doctrine and writing things down about what was thought at the time. So much more about him later. We don't know which one of these were written first. That I guess it doesn't really matter, but they were probably written around the same time. All of these writings do some important things for us. First of all, they provide a real clear picture as to the objections pagans raised against Christianity. So we know what practices the Christians were involved in that caused the problems, that caused the pagans to come against them. And that's definitely important to know that. It's important to understand why they had these objections and how they found fault in them. But it's also important because we can use these writings to see the way Christian doctrine developed. And the very act of having to give this defense of the faith really it was a big influence on the development of doctrine in Christianity. So just studying these apologists gives us a great way of seeing a very clear picture about how the development of Christian doctrine came along. So what was going on with Christian faith versus pagan culture? What were these things that the pagans in general just found objectionable about Christians? Well, one of the things was that Christians had rejected many aspects of pagan culture due to the worship of the gods. So much of what they did in their culture revolved around this worship, and they didn't really take it all that seriously, especially as time went on. It was more just a cultural type of thing. And people more or less, their idea was that these Christians they're not any fun. Why don't they just go along with this? Even if they don't believe it, if they don't believe that it's a real thing, then why should they care anyway if they say a prayer to a god or if we all bow down before one? Just go along with it, get in with everybody else, and then, we will listen more to what you have to say. Well, we know as Christians, you can't do that. It's not okay to just go with the flow when it comes to worshiping other gods. But the pagan culture had a problem with that. So what did this include? Well, a lot of the civil ceremonies involved the worship of gods. It just had it as part of the rituals that they were involved in. So you couldn't escape it if you're going to be in any of that. Even the study of classical literature, so much of classical literature had to do with the gods. And so Christians they just didn't want to be a part of that. They wanted to stay away from it. They were trying to be pure. And some of them took that in an extreme way, some of them not as much, but all of them rejected the idea of ever worshiping another god. Military service was even in question. Obviously, again, to this day, there are Christians that just believe that they're convicted that total pacifism is the only way. You can't be in any way involved in military service or in any kind of conflict against someone that would result in any kind of aggression or spilt blood or anything like that. So military service is off. But for all of the Christians, there was an issue due to the military offering sacrifices to both the emperor and the gods. So they didn't want to be involved in military service. So again, that was the pagans looking at them and like, okay, you won't join the military. You won't help defend your country. What's going on? You're using these lame excuses, but you really just don't want to be involved in this. And so there was a conflict there. So Christians actually took two stances on the value of classical literature. And we're going to look at two individuals and their way of combating these different issues. One who just totally wanted to go on the offensive against pagan culture, and one that really looked at pagan culture, the classical literature and culture and philosophical ideas as being very valuable. So didn't want to throw all that out, but still wanted to put Christianity in the primary position, but still value that. So they had two different stances, and it's that way, again, with so much of Christianity this day, we don't agree on everything. Even things that are written in the Bible that you would think, well, it's in black and white, it's in the scripture. People don't agree how to interpret it. We have so many doctrines that people disagree about. And then when you get into how to put it into practice, boy, there really are a lot of disagreements. So this is not anything new. It was going on from the very beginning. And we'll look at more of that in a moment. But before we do that, we're going to start with kind of the stance that was more of an offensive against any kind of pagan culture at all, just throwing it all out. And we're going to look at another guy for that. But I wanted to mention this quote again. Tertullian is such an influential writer and so important. We're going to read more about or listen more about him later. But he insisted on a radical opposition to pagan culture. He believed that many heresies resulted from the combination of Christian teaching with pagan philosophy. And guess what? He was right. One of the original ones that Paul really dealt with a lot were the Gnostics. And that's exactly what they did. They took Christian teaching and tried to combine it with pagan philosophical ideas, even pagan religious ideas, and they brought forth some of the first heresy and really were a problem. We'll look now at the one that we really want to focus on today, and this is the guy that we mentioned earlier, Tatian. He was one that went on the offensive against the pagan culture. And Tatian, in his address to the Greeks, wrote about attack Greek culture directly. He went right at it. And Tatian began by attacking the Greek language as not being pure because of multiple dialects. So he went at these elitists. You think the Greek language is so much better than everybody else's language, and it's the language that should be spoken by everybody that's cultured and learned. Well, guess what? Even in your own country, different regions have different dialects, so it's not all that pure. And he also criticized the invention of rhetoric, which he said led to people being dishonest and taking money to change what they said so that they would speak things that were not true and not just in order to get the money. So he was saying that your language that you're so proud of is not all that great. So he attacked them there. He pointed out that Greeks had taken valuable contributions from other cultures. So he pointed out several of these. He said the Greeks, they learned astronomy from the Babylonians, geometry from the Egyptians, and writing from the Phoenicians, and even philosophical thought and philosophy and religion. He said the writings of Moses are much older than those of Plato and even those of Homer. And Moses' writings were repeated, or at least the ideas in them were repeated in these other guys. So anything that they got that was worth anything or wise or of any, anything at all worthwhile, they got from somebody else. So he wanted to take them down a peg on that. He also attacked the pagan gods because of their acts of idolatry, incest, and infanticide. When you read all the classical literature of these pagan gods that you're supposed to be worshiping, well, they weren't all that great. They were always involved in just terrible acts against human beings, against each other. Their morality was not good. Their ethics was not good. And so reading this classic literature about these gods was not a good thing or a positive thing at all. And then finally, he reminded them that many of the statues of the gods, the statues that they would go and worship to, they actually, the people that made the statues used prostitutes as the models for them. And so he made the point that, hey, you guys, you think you're so much better than this lower class. Well, guess what? These gods you worship and bow down to, you elitist pagans, you're worshiping people from the lower classes. These were based on human beings that were prostitutes that you wouldn't even spit at in the street, and you're bowing down and worshiping to them. So Tatian really went on the offensive and attacked the culture. He went against everything that they were trying to say that made them superior to Christianity. And so that's one stance. And again, you look at these ideas, you look at these stances, they're not that much different than they are today. People that are Christians that are, don't like the culture that we live in, don't like the way things are going, you can approach it in a couple of different ways. And one way is just to attack it and say there's nothing of value in it. You need to completely remove yourself from it as much as possible. Don't do anything. Don't watch movies. Don't listen to secular music. Don't read those books from non-Christian writers. Just completely get that out of you. Keep it away because it's no good. So that's one stance. Again, this discussion is not about saying one's better, the other one's superior. I just want to make the point that kind of the more things change, the more they stay the same. We have the same ideas today. So Justin is also, again, I mentioned earlier, is probably the most influential one. And his stance on it was very different than Tatian's. He took a different approach. He wanted to show the connection between Christianity and classical wisdom. He was a philosopher himself, and in his move to Christianity, he became a Christian philosopher, but he didn't lose that philosophical thinking. He didn't want to throw that out. He didn't want to just say everything about this is trash, it's garbage, and throw it away. He wanted to keep it in, and so he had more of an approach that kind of showed how they could be joined together. He acknowledged that the best philosophers spoke of a supreme being who was the creator of all. He said, these guys, they're not completely wrong on everything, and all of their ideas are not completely contrary to Christianity. And one of the ones that he pointed out was the idea that there was a supreme being who was the creator of all. Justin would have just said, you know what, we agree on that, and let me tell you who that is. So he wanted to point that out. He said Socrates and Plato believed in life after death. So another one. Here's something we have in common rather than everything that we disagree on. Hey, we both believe that same thing. He also said Plato believed in realities beyond the present world. So the idea that there was another world beyond what we see in the physical world, a spiritual type of world, an eternal reality. Plato believed in that. And Justin said, hey, it's not contradictory to what the Word of God says. We have we look at it differently, and the ramifications of it may be different, but we believe at least we have this in common. So how was he able to explain there being agreement between the philosophers and Christianity? Well, he did that by the doctrine of the Logos. Now, when I say that word, this is a Greek word. It has two meanings. It means word and also reason. And those two meanings are important, but let me just say this about pronunciation. Logos or logos, either one is fine. Logos would be the Koine Greek pronunciation. It'd also probably be used more in a philosophical sense. Logos would be more used in modern times. So you probably pronounce it, a lot of people probably pronounce it logos. There's a popular Bible software that uses this word. And you will find people calling it logos, and then you have a lot of people calling it logos. It doesn't matter. Don't think you're better than somebody else or somebody saying it wrong. Either way is okay. But the pronunciation of the word is not as important as what it meant. And this concept, Justin opened the way for Christianity to claim the good in classical pagan culture. So how did he do that? I want to read to you from the book that I'm using for this study about this idea of the Logos. And I'm quoting from the book now. According to a tradition of long-standing in Greek philosophy, the human mind can understand reality because it shares in the Logos, or universal reason, that undergirds all reality. For instance, if we were able to understand that 2 and 2 make 4, the reason for this is that both in our minds and in the universe, there is a Logos, a reason or order, according to which 2 and 2 always make 4. The fourth gospel affirms that in Jesus, the Logos, or Word, was made flesh. Now, let me stop there. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. You know the quote I'm talking about. So that word for word in Greek was the actual word logos. And John used it there. So Justin really took hold of that. So according to Justin, what has happened, and I'm quoting again, in the incarnation is that the underlying reason of the universe, the logos or word of God, has come in the flesh. So Justin really took this Greek philosophical idea and personified it in Jesus. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't believe Jesus was God and that he was just a false philosophical idea. He just kind of combined the two ideas. Now, you can definitely get into an argument whether that's correct or not. And we really don't have time to get into these background of these Greek words, but I'll just mention this to you. Yes, these guys had some knowledge of Greek philosophy, but they had way more knowledge of what Greek words were used in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. A lot of these ideas that we get in the New Testament, these Greek words, really were more about what the concepts were that they read about in the Old Testament in Greek than they were about Greek philosophy. So I'm not saying John didn't use this intentionally. He was writing to Gentiles, and he probably did want to put this idea of this universal type of philosophical idea. But we can't go too far down that road. We have to be careful. But Justin took it and he ran with it. So continuing, let me quote again here. According to the fourth gospel, this Logos is the true light that enlightens everyone. This means that even before the incarnation, he is the source of all true knowledge. Paul had already said in 1 Corinthians 10, 1-4, that the ancient Hebrews' faith rested on none other than Christ, who had been revealed to them even before the incarnation. Now Justin added that there were also among the pagans those who knew the same Logos, however dimly. Whatever truth there is in the writings of Plato was granted to him by the Logos of God, the same Logos who was incarnate in Jesus. So boil all this down. What's the idea Justin is saying? Basically, he's saying is all truth is God's truth. So if you find anything to be true, if there's anything valid at all, then it came from God. And so even these Greek philosophers, the things that they found that were true, like the idea that there is a supreme being out there who created everything, the idea that there is life beyond the grave, the idea that there's another a realm, a spiritual realm, everything that we see in the material world is not all there is. Those things were revealed to them by God. They got that truth from the only source of truth there is, this same idea that was in Greek philosophy, this Logos, and that was Jesus himself. So by doing that, that opened Justin up to say we don't have to throw everything out from the pagan culture. We can look at what fits in Christianity and we can take those ideas. We don't have to throw them away. We can read about them. And even better than that, we can use them to work in and really appeal to people that already have these ideas as part of their culture in a way to say, hey, you know what, we both agree on this. Let me tell you who that supreme being is. Or let me tell you more about what we say is beyond the grave. We both have these philosophies in mind, and even be able to go and quote Socrates or quote Plato about what they said about life after death and say, hey, we agree with this, and let me tell you what that means. So it's using what's already out there that is truth. It's not in conflict with what Christianity says. It's just not from a Christian source. It's actually from a pagan source. And again, this is controversial even today. But if you study the history of the church, this concept is probably one of the most important ones when it came to the spread of Christianity around the world. And you see it even in Paul. Paul quoted from Greek philosophers. He did that. You can read about that in his letters. In his writing to Titus, he talks about the Cretans. He also, if you read in Acts, he went to Mars Hill and he talked about the God there, the unknown God that they kind of had in case they missed anybody. And he said, well, hey, let me tell you about who the unknown God is. So, Paul kind of did this himself, I think. And Justin is carrying on this idea. Christians, as they evangelize, they run around the world and they use parts of the culture to be able to teach Christian things that could be ringing of truth. So this bothers a lot of Christians today. If you talk to people that are Christians, you'll get different ideas about things like Christmas traditions. So one of the Christmas traditions that we have is bringing in evergreen trees, Christmas trees. Well, where did that idea come from? It came from pagan culture. They brought in the green. And the reason they did that is that evergreen was symbolic of everlasting life. These trees never died. And so it reminded them of that. And in some ways, it was a religious thing as well. Well, that's very easy for a Christian to take and say, hey, you know what? We agree on that. There is everlasting life. And let me tell you about how you can have that everlasting life. And so instead of just throwing that out and saying, hey, that is pagan, that is wrong, this has to do with celebrating other gods and worshiping other gods, they adopted it into Christianity, Christian thinking. And in such a way, they were able to really move around the world and really spread Christianity all throughout the world. So again, not everybody agrees with this, though. You get different ideas about this. Halloween's another one. That's very controversial. A lot of Christians want nothing to do with it. But if you read and look back at the origins of Halloween and how the church kind of came in and didn't just throw it out, but added the next day, All Saints Day on November 1st. It's a way of talking about the dead. We need to discuss what happens when you die. Do people come back from the dead? Well, yes. We believe as Christians that there is resurrection. It's not like what Halloween does, but those ideas are not, you can't throw them out. Now, again, I'm not telling you to go celebrate Halloween. I'm not telling you to change what you feel about these ideas. I'm just telling you that this is two different ways of looking at this. You can go completely against the culture and fight it tooth and nail, or you can use it in ways not to compromise, but use it in ways to try to reach the culture. And you see this even today. I thought about this one. You're going to think that I'm crazy. But I thought about, there's this song that I heard years ago by Kesha. Kesha. I know you probably never thought you'd hear that name on this teaching. But she wrote this song. I don't know if she wrote it. She performed it. It's called We Are Who We Are. And I heard the song a couple of times, and this line stood out to me. It said, if you're one of us, then roll with us. So the idea there is, hey, you say you're one of us, you say you're with us, then you better be doing what we do. Don't say you're with us and then you're doing the opposite. Come on and go with us. Well, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, didn't Jesus say a similar thing? He said, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather scatters. So basically he's saying, if you're with me, then do what I'm doing. Because if you're not with me gathering, then you're scattering. You're causing problems. You're either with me or you're not. And the way I know you're with me is if you're doing the same things I'm doing. There's no two ways. You can't have a middle ground. There's truth in this stupid pop song. And if it's true, does that concept is the truth from God? And somebody latched on to something that happens to be true about the way the world works. You can argue where that comes from. That's fine. But the idea there is you could use that to somebody that heard that song to be able to talk about the idea of, be true to who you are. If you want to go with God, don't say that you're with him and then you live contradictory to that. If you're with him, you go with him. Yeah, it has to be that way. It's not okay to be both ways. So again, crazy thought, but the fact is these two different ideas are still out there. But one of the biggest ones, again, as we go through this, you're definitely going to see those Christians that just went head first, hard head. I'm not going to go along with any of this. Very devout, not criticizing them at all for their convictions. Now, I'm not criticizing anybody today for those same convictions. Please don't misunderstand this. We have to be careful about legalism, but a heart that wants to be true to what God says, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But on the other hand, there also have been a lot of people and cultures reached through the years by going more for let me show you not how we're different, but how we have some things in common. And maybe that would help you to understand how you can step into this world. So I've gone long this time. It looks like 14 minutes. I'm not quite done yet. But we're going to wrap things up now. And when we meet again next week, when you get a chance to hear this, we'll be looking at the 3rd century and going back into more of these writers, these very influential Christians that came along and what some of their teachings were, and also what some of these heresies were. They, right from the start in Christianity, there were some very negative teachings. Paul fought against it, and it didn't end with him. It carried on, and really a lot of the doctrines that developed came as a result of fighting this stuff. I've said before, theology and doctrines and doctrinal study is a necessary evil. In other words, it's human beings trying to make sense of what God had to say, and it's going to be flawed. It's not perfect. Be very careful out there. I want you to hear this. If you are beholden to anybody's philosophical or, doctrinal or theological ideas in a vacuum and that's all you want to hear, be careful about that, because understand that is coming from a flawed human being. It is not going to be perfect. It can be very helpful, but there's going to be flaws in it. Don't think it's perfect. I don't care what it is. I have those same hangups. I have to watch myself. But the development of these doctrines came along as a necessity to be able to fight against these teachings that were heretical and wrong. And so we're going to look at some of that next week. I think it's going to be really, really good. And that's really going to set the tone for a lot of what we'll study going forward. And it's going to help us also to understand what we should believe doctrinally and theologically, and what some different ideas that came along from that. So I think it'll help you also in your walk with the Lord. And I hope that you'll enjoy that. So again, let me end by saying that a lot of this information, I even quoted directly from it today, is from a book called The Story of Christianity in Volume 1 by Justo L. Gonzalez, an excellent book. This is something that I studied in my undergraduate work as a student in college studying, it's called Christian Ministries, but religion, at East Texas Baptist University, and then also in seminary as well. So this is a seminary level book, but it's not inaccessible. It's easy to read. And I would definitely recommend you read it sometime, but you're getting a good picture of it through this study, I think. I'm going chapter by chapter. I'm not hitting every single thing in it, but definitely hitting the high points. And I want to give that man credit because it's excellent writing. And I use some other sources too, but that's the main one. So again, hope you have a great week. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry it went long this week. I promised you 30 minutes. You got an extra 16. And I'll try to not let that be a regular thing. But again, hope you had a great week, and hope you had a happy Easter last weekend. And God bless. Be well, and I'll be talking to you next week.